We're going to be talking about covalent naming. We previously talked about in our ionic bonding unit the nomenclature. However, today we're going to be talking about some of the differences with naming covalent compounds. What I have here is a flowchart for how we talk about naming binary covalent compounds. We'll have our first element and our second element. For the first element, we'll include the element name. If that element has a subscript of 1, it is just that element name. We do not include a prefix. So if there's no subscript, it's an implied 1. However, if it's any other subscript, it would then include a prefix. For the second element, it always includes a prefix. Then you take the root of the element name, take the ending off, and add IDE. So we're going to go through some examples with the prefixes and some of the naming. For the prefixes, these are the first 1 through 10 prefixes. There are more prefix names, but we're going to stick to 10 for this. Only the second element can get the mono prefix. So as I said before, with the first element, if it has a subscript of 1 or no subscript, which is an implied 1, then that first element will just be the element name. If it's any other number, di, tri, tetra, penta, the first element would get the prefix. The second always gets the prefix, so in that case, the second element could be mono, di, tri, tetra, and so forth. We're going to do some naming practice where we're going to look at covalent compounds and name them according to these rules. So we're going to do some naming practice. Our first one is CO2. For our first element, carbon, there is no subscript. That's an implied 1. In this case, that means that all we need to do is write the element name, because remember, mono is not a prefix we use for the first element. So in this case, we would have carbon. Now our next element is oxygen. There are 2 oxygens. We see that subscript of 2, and so we go over to our prefix table and we see that 2 is di. So in this case we put di, and then we do our root plus IDE. So for oxygen, we take off the ending, so we do OX, and then we add on that new ending or suffix IDE. So we get carbon dioxide, and that is the name of CO2, carbon dioxide. Now we can go to our next one, N2O4. Nitrogen is our first element, and we see that it has a subscript of 2. So in that case, we have di, and then we just write the element name, dinitrogen. And now for our second element, we have oxygen, and there are 4 oxygens. So we go over to our prefix table, and we see that 4 is tetra. So we're going to do the same thing. Tetra. We take our root for oxygen, that's OX, take the ending off, and then add the new ending, which is IDE. So we have dinitrogen tetraoxide. Our final one is SF2. Our first element is sulfur, and in that case, sulfur has an implied prefix or applied subscript of 1. So in that case, we just need to write sulfur. We don't use the mono prefix for the first element. And then our second element is fluorine. There are 2 fluorines. We go over to our prefix table. We see that it's di. We do di. We take the root, take off the ending of fluorine, and add IDE instead. So we get sulfur difluoride. We can do some more naming practices with these. In this case, we have CBr4. Now that carbon is our first element. There is only 1 carbon, and so we don't use the mono prefix. We're just going to write carbon. Now our second element is bromine, and there are 4 bromines. So we can go over to our prefix table and see that it's tetra. And write tetra. Then we take our root from bromine, B-R-O-M, and then we add the I-D-E ending, in this case, bromide. This case, CBr4 is carbon tetrabromide. Our next one that we can do, we're going to go the other way, dinitrogen pentoxide. So in this case, dinitrogen, that's telling us there are 2 nitrogens as our first element. So we can write N, subscript of 2. Pentoxide. Penta is 5 from our prefix table, and oxide tells us that it's oxygen. So in this case, we can put O, 5. Dinitrogen pentoxide would be N2O5. So in this case, these are all of our practice problems. We can go through all of these covalent and ionic naming now, and we can name them according to the rules for our binary and ionic nomenclature. This is just an overview of what we've learned so far. For covalent, we take our first element. If there is a prefix that is not mono, we use the prefix and element name. Then for the second element, we always use a prefix plus the root of the element name, take off the ending, add IDE. Ionic is similar. Our cation is first. We do the element name or the polyatomic ion name. If it is an element name, if it's one of those metal cations that has more than one possible charge, we do Roman numerals and parentheses. And then we move on to our anion. Very similar, we take our root of that element name, add IDE. Or if it's a polyatomic ion, we just do the name of that. So we can go through now and name binary, ionic, and covalent compounds.